In the autumn chill of 1348, as the fog rolled off the Thames, a young apprentice named Thomas huddled in his master's cramped workshop near London Bridge. The air reeked of sewage and smoke from the nearby tanneries. He wiped sweat from his brow, ignoring the strange ache in his limbs. By dawn, black swellings bloomed under his arms, like rotten fruit. Buboes, they called them later. Thomas collapsed, screaming as fever ravaged his body. Neighbors barred their doors, whispering prayers. Within days, carts rattled through the streets, piled high with corpses, the bell ringer's cry echoing, "Bring out your dead." This was no ordinary sickness. This was the great mortality, the Black Death, devouring London from within. In a city of 70,000 souls, it would claim tens of thousands, shattering lives, faith, and society. Yet amid the horror, stories of survival, defiance, and change emerged. This is the tale of life and death in London during the plague. London in 1348 was a bustling hive of commerce and chaos, the heart of England's trade. Narrow streets twisted like veins through overcrowded wards, where timber-framed houses leaned precariously over open gutters flowing with human waste and animal filth. The River Thames, lifeline of the city, was a murky artery clogged with refuse from butchers, dyers, and brewers. Merchants from distant ports unloaded spices, wool, and wine at the docks, unaware that their ships carried a deadlier cargo. Fleas infested with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium we now know as the cause of bubonic plague. The first whispers of doom came from the continent. Traders spoke of a great pestilence ravaging Italy and France, where entire villages turned to ghost towns overnight. In June 1348, the plague struck England's southern coast at Melcombe in Dorset, likely aboard a ship from Gascony. It spread like wildfire through the countryside, carried by rats and fleas on carts of grain and cloth. By November, as All Saints' Day feasts turned somber, the disease reached London. Chroniclers like the anonymous author of the Rochester Chronicle described the onset. The pestilence arrived in London at about the Feast of All Saints, and daily deprived many of life. The city's conditions were perfect for disaster, with a population estimated at 50,000 to 70,000, making it England's largest city. Homes were packed with families, apprentices, and servants. Sanitation was rudimentary, cesspits overflowed, and chamber pots were emptied into streets. Rats thrived in the thatched roofs and dirt floors, their fleas jumping the human hosts. Initial cases appeared in the poorer parishes near the docks, like St. Botolph, without Aldgate. Victims first felt a chill, then fever spiked to delirium. Black buboes, swollen lymph nodes, erupted in the groin, armpits, or neck, oozing pus and blood. Some coughed up bloody sputum, signaling the pneumonic form, spread directly through air. Death came swiftly, often within 3 to 7 days. It grew so powerful, one account noted, that between Candlemas and Easter, more than 200 corpses were buried almost every day in the new burial ground made next to Smithfield. Wealthy merchants and nobles fled to country estates, leaving the poor to fend for themselves. King Edward III and his court retreated to Windsor, issuing edicts from afar. The mayor, John de Pulteney, ordered streets cleaned of filth, but enforcement was haphazard. Butchers were forbidden to slaughter in public, and stray dogs and pigs, thought to spread miasma, the bad air believed to cause the plague, were culled. Daily life ground to a halt. Markets thinned as vendors sickened or feared contagion. Taverns emptied, their ale undrunk. Apprentices like Thomas found workshops shuttered, masters dead or dying. Families barricaded themselves indoors, but the plague seeped through cracks. One survivor, a monk named John Klyn, wrote elsewhere, "Scarcely anyone dared to touch or bury the bodies for fear of infection." Yet amid the fear, acts of humanity flickered. Physicians like John of Ardern donned beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing they filtered poisonous vapors. Though ineffective, they ventured into homes, lancing buboes or applying poultices of onions and vinegar. Priests administered last rites, risking their lives. Many succumbed, leaving parishes without spiritual guidance. By early 1349, The plague peaked. Carts trundled through fog-shrouded streets at dawn and dusk, collectors in rags shouting for the dead. Bodies wrapped in shrouds or naked were stacked like cordwood. Traditional burials ceased. Mass pits were dug at East Smithfield and other sites, where thousands lay in layers, sprinkled with lime. Archaeologists later uncovered these grim testaments, skeletons intertwined, some with coins clutched in bony hands. For the afterlife, the social fabric frayed, orphans roamed, begging for scraps. Crime surged, looting empty homes, while authorities struggled to maintain order. The Black Death did not discriminate, striking rich and poor, though the malnourished underclass suffered most. London's Jewish community, already scapegoated, faced pogroms. False rumors accused them of poisoning wells. As spring turned to summer, the death rate slowed, but the scars remained. London's population plummeted by 500%, from perhaps 60,000 to 30,000. Empty houses stood silent, fields untended. Yet this catastrophe sowed seeds of change as survivors navigated a transformed world. The Black Death did not arrive as a sudden storm, but as a creeping shadow that darkened every corner of London life. By the winter of 1348 to 1349, the city had become a place where routine itself felt like defiance. Those who remained, whether through poverty, duty, or stubborn hope, adapted to a rhythm punctuated by fear and loss. Mornings began earlier than before. The curfew bell, once a gentle reminder to extinguish lights, now tolled with grim purpose. Watchmen patrolled the narrow lanes calling, "Bring out your dead!" in hoarse voices. Families who had lost someone during the night wrapped the body in whatever cloth remained, old sheets, cloaks, or nothing at all, and placed it at the door. The corpse bearers, rough men paid by the parish or by desperation, arrived with hand barrows or horse-drawn carts. They lifted the dead without ceremony, stacking them until the load threatened to topple. One chronicler recorded that in some weeks, the carts carried as many as 500 bodies a day to the mass graves. The burial grounds themselves were scenes of horror and haste. The churchyards of St. Paul's, St. Mary-le-Bow, and dozens of smaller parish churches quickly filled. New cemeteries were consecrated in haste. The largest, at East Smithfield, just outside the eastern wall, swallowed thousands in layered trenches. Priests, when they could be found, recited hurried prayers over open pits. Sometimes the living were buried with the dead. Those too weak to protest were lowered in alongside family members. Lime was scattered to hasten decomposition and reduce the stench, but the smell of decay hung over the city like a pall. Food became scarce and expensive. With fields untended and trade routes disrupted, grain shipments from the countryside dwindled. Bakers' ovens stood cold for days at a time. Those who could afford it bought bread at inflated prices, sometimes mixed with sawdust or acorns. The poor turned to nettles, roots, and whatever scraps they could scavenge. Fishmongers still plied their trade along the Thames, but fewer boats came upriver. Ale, the staple drink of every class, grew weaker as malt supplies ran low. Taverns that once rang with laughter now served silent customers who drank quickly and left. Work continued, though in a ghostly fashion. Guilds tried to maintain order, but many masters had died, leaving apprentices to fend for themselves. Tailors stitched shrouds instead of fine garments. Blacksmiths forged tools for grave digging rather than plows. The building trade slowed. Half-finished timber frames sagged under snow. Yet necessity drove some occupations forward. Barbers, who doubled as surgeons, lanced buboes and applied leeches or hot irons in attempts to draw out the poison. Apothecaries sold theriac, a costly paste of dozens of ingredients, said to be a universal antidote, though most knew it offered little protection. The wealthy who remained in the city barricaded themselves in their stone houses along Thames Street or in the Cheapside district. They burned juniper and frankincense to purify the air, avoided crowds, and drank vinegar or wine laced with herbs. Some followed the advice of physicians who recommended flight, moderation in diet, and abstaining from hot foods like garlic or onions. Yet even these measures failed. One noble family lost 7 members in a single week, despite every precaution. Religion offered both comfort and terror. Churches remained open when priests were available, but many parishes stood empty. Sermons, when delivered, warned of divine wrath for the sins of pride, greed, and lechery. Flagellants. Groups of penitents who whip. Fear bred suspicion. Neighbors watched one another for signs of illness. A cough, a limp, a feverish flush. When symptoms appeared, doors were barred, windows shuttered. Some families abandoned their own kin, leaving them to die in isolation. Rumors spread of deliberate poisoners. Strangers were driven from wards with stones and curses. The small Jewish community in the city, already confined to the area around Old Jewry, faced renewed violence. Although no major pogrom occurred in London itself during the plague years, unlike in York or other towns, fear and scapegoating simmered. Despite the darkness, glimmers of resilience appeared. Midwives continued to attend births, often delivering infants into a world already mourning their parents. Street sellers still cried their wares, though fewer and quieter, offering apples, onions, or candles. Ballads and tales circulated orally, some mocking death, others mourning lost loves. In taverns that remained open, men sang songs of defiance, raising cups to absent friends. By midsummer 1349, the plague's fury began to wane in London. The death rate dropped, though sporadic cases continued. The city breathed again, but it was a changed place. Houses stood empty, rents fell, wages for survivors rose as labor became scarce. The catastrophe had exposed the fragility of medieval society and planted the seeds of its transformation. As the Black Death receded in the summer of 1349, London emerged from its nightmare, not as a triumphant survivor, but as a city profoundly altered. The streets, once teeming with life, now echoed with an unnatural quiet. Empty houses gaped like wounds, their doors ajar, belongings scattered by looters or the wind. Weeds pushed through cobblestones untrodden for months. The population, decimated, left a void that reshaped every aspect of society, from the bonds between neighbors to the balance of power between lords and laborers. The immediate social impact was one of fragmentation. Families were torn asunder. A merchant might lose his wife and children in a week, only to remarry hastily for companionship or to manage his household. Widows, suddenly heads of households, navigated a world that offered them few rights. Some inherited property under common law, but many faced eviction by grasping relatives or landlords. Orphans, numbering in the thousands, became wards of the parish or were apprenticed out quickly to ease the burden on communities. The Court of Orphans, established earlier but overwhelmed now, handled inheritances for minors, often placing them with guardians who exploited their estates. Class divisions, already stark in medieval London, cracked under the strain. The nobility and wealthy burgesses who had fled returned to find their estates untended and servants dead. Yet the plague had leveled some hierarchies in death. A lord's body rotted beside a beggar's in the same pit. Survivors among the lower classes sensed opportunity. With labor scarce, peasants and workers demanded higher wages. A thatcher who once earned 2 pence a day now asked for 6. Bakers, carpenters, and masons followed suit. This shift alarmed the elite. King Edward III, from his safe haven, issued the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Laborers in 1351. These laws capped wages at pre-plague levels and forbade workers from leaving their parishes without permission. Violators faced fines or imprisonment. Enforcement proved challenging in chaotic London. Justices of the peace, newly empowered, patrolled markets and taverns, but bribery and evasion were rife. Workers formed informal guilds or simply moved to where pay was better, often to the city itself, where rebuilding created demand. Rents plummeted as landlords competed for tenants. A house that rented for 40 shillings a year before the plague now fetched half that. Some properties stood vacant for years, reverting to the crown or church. Economically, the plague accelerated changes already underway. Trade, London's lifeblood, stuttered but did not stop. The wool export to Flanders, crucial for England's economy, resumed haltingly as ships returned to the Thames. Merchants like those in the Woolmongers' Company adapted by consolidating holdings. Survivors inherited partnerships, creating larger enterprises. The Hanseatic League, with its contour at the Steelyard, saw German traders fill gaps left by English deaths. Imports of wine from Bordeaux and spices from Venice trickled in, but at higher prices due to disrupted supply chains. Agriculture around London suffered deeply. Fields in the surrounding manors lay fallow, harvests rotted ungathered, livestock wandered untended, leading to murrains, animal plagues, that compounded food shortages. Yet this scarcity drove innovation. Surviving farmers adopted more efficient methods, like enclosing common lands for sheep rearing, boosting wool production. In the city, markets like Cheapside and Leadenhall adapted. Butchers, restricted during the height of the plague, now slaughtered openly again, their offal drawing rats anew. The plague also strained the city's governance. The mayor and aldermen, many of whom had perished, were replaced hastily. Civic records from the period show frantic efforts to maintain order. Ordinances against price gouging, mandates for street cleaning, and taxes to fund orphan care. The Common Council met irregularly, its debates colored by grief and suspicion. Corruption flourished. Some officials embezzled funds meant for plague victims' families. On a personal level, the upheaval manifested in changed behaviors. Marriages increased post-plague as survivors sought to repopulate and secure inheritances. Birth rates spiked in 1350 to 1351, though infant mortality remained high. Social mobility quickened. A former serf might buy freedom with higher wages, moving to London to start a trade. Women, in particular, found new roles. With men dead, some took over businesses, brewing ale, selling cloth, or running inns. Guilds, traditionally male, admitted widows to continue their husbands' crafts. Yet not all changes were positive. Crime rose sharply. Highwaymen preyed on roads leading to the city, robbing returning refugees. In London, burglaries targeted empty homes, and prostitution increased as destitute women sought survival. Alehouses became hotbeds of unrest, where laborers grumbled against the wage laws. Riots erupted sporadically, foreshadowing the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which would trace its roots to these inequities. Through it all, a sense of impermanence settled over London. Chronicles speak of a great emptiness, but also of renewal. The plague had winnowed the weak. Some said leaving the strong to rebuild. Markets bustled again by 1350, though with fewer voices. Churches, depleted of clergy, saw lay preachers emerge. The city, scarred but resilient, began to knit itself back together, though the threads were forever altered. With the Black Death's retreat, Londoners confronted not just physical ruins, but a profound crisis of meaning. The plague had upended the medieval worldview, where disease was seen as divine punishment or astrological misfortune. Churches, once sanctuaries, now evoked memories of unanswered prayers and piled corpses. This reckoning reshaped faith, art, literature, and customs, leaving a legacy that echoed through centuries. Spiritually, the plague eroded trust in the church. Priests had died at alarming rates, perhaps 50 to 60% in some dioceses, leaving flocks without shepherds. In London, Bishop Ralph de Shrewsbury of Bath and Wells allowed laypeople to hear confessions in emergencies, a radical departure from doctrine. Survivors questioned why God had allowed such suffering. Some turned to heresy, like the Lollards who would later challenge papal authority, influenced by this disillusionment. Others embraced mysticism, seeking personal communion with the divine amid institutional failure. Pilgrimages surged post-plague. London's own shrines, like the tomb of Edward the Confessor at Westminster Abbey, drew crowds seeking miracles. Yet attendance at Mass waned initially. Fear of contagion lingered, and empty pews symbolized lost faith. Indulgences, papal promises of reduced time in purgatory, were sold more aggressively to fund rebuilding, sowing seeds of resentment that fueled the Reformation. Art reflected the trauma. Pre-plague works celebrated chivalry and piety. Post-plague, macabre themes dominated. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became popular in murals and manuscripts. In London, though few survive, similar motifs appeared in parish churches like St. Olave's, where skeletons danced with kings, merchants, and peasants, reminding all of mortality's equality. Illuminated books from scriptoria along Paternoster Row depicted plague scenes, arrow-wielding angels striking sinners, or Christ weeping over mass graves. These images, in somber blacks, reds, and golds, captured the era's melancholy. Literature, too, bore the plague's imprint. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written decades later, but informed by the period, features pilgrims fleeing a pestilential London. His characters, knights, millers, wives, embody the social mixing accelerated by death. Earlier chroniclers like Henry Knighton described the plague with apocalyptic fervor. Such a shortage of workers ensued that the humble turned up their noses at employment and could scarcely be persuaded to serve the eminent for triple wages. Ballads sung in alehouses lamented lost loves or mocked greedy landlords. One popular rhyme warned, "The plague comes for all, rich and poor alike. No gold can buy back the breath of life." Customs evolved in response to grief. Funerals, once elaborate processions with hired mourners, became simple affairs. Wills proliferated. Londoners, facing sudden death, dictated testaments from sickbeds, bequeathing goods to churches or kin. The plague popularized the cadaver tomb, effigies showing the deceased as a rotting corpse beneath a dignified portrait, as seen in later monuments at St. Paul's. Feasts like Corpus Christi gained somber undertones, with processions honoring the Eucharist as a plague ward. Medicine advanced haltingly. The plague discredited humoral theory somewhat, as balancing blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile failed spectacularly. Surgeons like those in the Barber Surgeons Company experimented with quarantines, inspired by Italian practices. Herbals recommended posies of roses and herbs echoed in the nursery rhyme, "Ring-a-ring-a roses," to combat miasma. Though ineffective against bacteria, these efforts laid groundwork for public health. London's aldermen passed ordinances for isolation houses, or pest houses, foreshadowing later plague responses. Culturally, the plague fostered a carpe diem ethos. With death omnipresent, survivors indulged in pleasures denied during the crisis. Taverns overflowed with raucous gatherings. Gambling and dancing increased, drawing clerical condemnation. Fashion shifted. Sumptuary laws, meant to curb extravagance, were flouted as lower classes aped noble attire with higher wages. Bright silks and furs appeared in markets, symbolizing defiance against fate. Yet this hedonism masked deeper despair. Suicides rose, though underreported due to stigma. Dreams and visions proliferated. Some claimed apparitions of the Virgin offering protection. Others saw demonic portents. Astrology boomed. Almanacs predicting planetary alignments sold briskly at St. Paul's churchyard. Education suffered. Schools attached to chantries closed as masters died. Oxford and Cambridge, sources of London's clerks, lost scholars, delaying intellectual recovery. Yet the need for literate administrators grew, prompting informal apprenticeships. In women's lives, the reckoning brought mixed fortunes. With men scarce, some gained independence, running shops or guilds. Yet patriarchal structures reasserted. Widows often remarried quickly under pressure. Literature portrayed women as both victims, like Boccaccio's tales influencing English writers, and resilient figures. By the 1360s, as London rebuilt, the plague's cultural scars began to heal into new forms. Faith evolved toward personal piety, art toward humanism, society toward mobility. The Black Death had not just killed, it had compelled reinvention, setting the stage for the Renaissance's dawn. In the years following the Black Death, London did not simply return to its pre-plague state. The catastrophe had etched itself into the city's bones, influencing its growth, governance, and spirit for generations. By 1350, as sporadic cases faded, the survivors, now a more mobile, demanding populace, began the slow work of reconstruction. This legacy unfolded in waves. Immediate recovery efforts gave way to long-term transformations, reshaping London into a more resilient, if wary, metropolis. Physically, the city bore visible scars. Abandoned houses crumbled, their timbers scavenged for fuel or new builds. Weeds overgrew once bustling yards, and feral animals roamed the outskirts. The mayor and aldermen prioritized rebuilding infrastructure. Streets were repaved, gutters deepened to carry away filth more effectively. The Thames wharves, vital for trade, were repaired hastily to welcome ships again. New ordinances mandated stone construction over timber in some areas to reduce fire risk. Though enforcement lagged, the mass graves at Smithfield and elsewhere were capped with earth, some later built over. Their locations forgotten until modern excavations revealed them. Demographically, recovery was uneven. London's population halved, rebounded slowly through immigration. Rural peasants freed from manorial bonds by labor shortages flocked to the city seeking higher wages. By 1377, a poll tax census estimated around 30,000 inhabitants, still below pre-plague levels. This influx diversified the city. Cornish miners, Welsh drovers, and even foreign artisans from Flanders and Italy settled in wards like Farringdon and Crippletate. Birth rates climbed as young couples married earlier, but recurring plague outbreaks in 1361, 1369, and beyond kept numbers in check. Economically, the legacy was revolutionary. The labor shortage empowered workers, leading to the breakdown of feudalism. Peasants demanded, and often won, commutation of serfdom for cash rents. In London, guilds strengthened, negotiating better terms with masters. The Statute of Laborers, meant to freeze wages, instead sparked resistance. Fines for violations filled civic coffers, but bred resentment. Culminating in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, rebels from Kent and Essex marched on London, burning records at the Temple and beheading Archbishop Simon Sudbury at Tower Hill. Though crushed, the revolt forced concessions, accelerating social mobility. Trade rebounded with vigor. Wool exports surged as sheep farming expanded on depopulated lands. London's merchants, consolidated into fewer, wealthier hands, invested in larger ventures. The Company of Merchant Adventurers, formalized later, traced roots to this era. Piraeus-like, the port bustled anew with cogs unloading Bordeaux wine and Baltic timber. Prosperity trickled down. Higher wages meant better diets, with more meat and ale for the common folk. Yet inequality persisted. The rich built grander homes, like those along Strand with gardens overlooking the river. Governance evolved toward greater centralization. The plague exposed weaknesses in parish-level administration, prompting the Crown to intervene more. Edward III's successors expanded the role of justices, who oversaw not just labor laws, but public health. Pest houses became permanent fixtures, isolating the sick during later outbreaks. The city walls, long neglected, were fortified against both disease and unrest. Civic pride grew. Landmarks like the rebuilt Guildhall symbolized renewal, its halls hosting feasts to boost morale. Culturally, the Black Death's shadow lingered in folklore and memory. Tales of ghostly plague carts rattling at night persisted in ballads. The nursery rhyme Ring a Ring a Roses likely originated here, its falling down mimicking sudden death. Art continued its morbid turn, with memento mori jewelry, rings engraved with skulls, popular among the elite. Literature immortalized the era. Chaucer's works subtly critiqued social follies exposed by the plague, while later writers like Daniel Defoe in A Journal of the Plague Year, set in 1665, but drawing on 1348 accounts, evoked its horrors. Spiritually, recovery meant reform. The church, depleted, recruited hastily, leading to less educated clergy and calls for change. John Wycliffe's Lollard movement, advocating Bible translation and criticizing corruption, gained traction in London pulpits. Chantries, endowed chapels for praying for the dead, multiplied as survivors sought to secure their souls. Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's saw new altars funded by plague bequests. Women's roles expanded enduringly. With demographic shifts, more entered the workforce. Brewsters, female brewers, dominated the ale trade, and silkwomen wove luxury goods in Spitalfields. Legal records show increased female litigants suing for inheritances or debts, yet gains were fragile. By the 1400s, guilds restricted women's membership again. Environmentally, the plague prompted reflection. Miasma theory persisted, but cleaner streets and better waste management reduced rat populations indirectly. Gardens flourished in vacant lots, providing herbs for medicine and food. The city's green spaces, like moorfields, became refuges for recreation. By the late 14th century, London had not only recovered but grown. Population neared 50,000 by 1400, fueled by opportunity. The Black Death, for all its devastation, catalyzed progress, from feudal decay to proto-capitalism, from blind faith to questioning reform. It taught harsh lessons in resilience, reminding Londoners that from death's grip could spring new life. The city that emerged was tougher, more dynamic, a precursor to the Renaissance powerhouse it would become. As the fog lifted over the Thames, the bells of St. Paul's rang not just for the dead, but for the living, tolling a new era. Centuries later, the Black Death's imprint on London remains indelible, a ghost woven into the city's fabric. The mass graves unearthed during modern construction, skeletons at Crossrail's Liverpool Street Station in 2015, remind us of the human cost. DNA from those bones confirmed Yersinia pestis, linking medieval horror to scientific understanding. London's recovery paved the way for its ascent. The labor shifts contributed to the end of serfdom, fostering a wage economy that powered the Tudor boom. Cultural echoes persist in literature, from Shakespeare's plague-haunted plays to Defoe's vivid journal. Public health lessons informed responses to later epidemics, like the Great Plague of 1665, which killed another 100,000, but saw better quarantines. Today, as pandemics like COVID-19 evoke parallels, London's resilience shines. The city that survived the Great Mortality grew into a global hub, its streets now thrumming with millions. Yet in quiet churchyards or along the Thames' fog-shrouded banks, one can almost hear the faint echo, "Bring out your dead," a reminder that from ashes, empires rise.